Welcome to Austen Mondays. I am your host, Edward G. Pettit from the Rosenbach Museum and Library in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And for 24 weeks, we are going on a biblio-venture with Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. In each episode, I'll talk with a special guest, a brilliant Austen scholar, creator, or Janeite about Austen and her works. And then I'll have an hour-long conversational annotation with a chapter co-host in which we illuminate, elucidate, and explicate a few chapters of Pride and Prejudice. And our special guest for today's episode is novelist Natalie Jenner. Natalie, welcome to Austen Mondays.
Hi, Ed. Thanks so much for having me on tonight. Thrilled.
Good. All righty. This is going to be great. We'll talk in a minute, because when we met over Austen years ago in Philly, and I know that's an important story that you tell as well. And after Natalie, everyone, stay tuned for our chapter annotation segment. Tonight we'll have Dr. Kathleen Hudson on, and she will be joining me to talk about chapters 7 through 9. And we're calling that Sweet Jane and Muddy Elizabeth Visit Netherfield. First, welcome back to all our Janeites in the audience from all over the place. Baja California, Mexico, Indianapolis, Indiana, Kensington, Philadelphia, yo Philly, I'm always with you. Ontario, Canada, Massachusetts, Michigan, all over the place. It's so nice that people are joining from all over the world and the US to watch the show. Where are you, Natalie?
I'm in Ontario.
In Ontario. So
there's two of us up here, apparently.
You have a friend joining you, Jackie, maybe? So
no, I mean
a fan now. So there you go. If you're watching live, I invite you to enjoy yourselves talking to each other on the live chat on YouTube. You can also post questions for there for me or our guests, and I'll do my best to get them onto the show. We have to relay them over. It doesn't always work out exceptionally well, but if I don't get to your question, I will post an answer in the comment section under the episode. So, you can always send me an email to epettit@rosenbach.org and send a question that I may be able to put on the show. So let's get on with it. For today's A Turn About the Room, please welcome Natalie Jenner. Natalie is the internationally best-selling author of the Jane Austen Society. Here it is. And Bloomsbury Girls, which were both instant national bestsellers, Amazon Best Books of the Month, Indie Next Picks, and People Magazine Books of the Week. The runner-up for Best Historical Fiction in the 2020 Goodreads Choice Awards. The Jane Austen Society has been sold for translation in over 20 countries and has been optioned for film and television. Born in England and raised in Canada, Natalie has been a corporate lawyer and a career coach, and once owned an independent bookstore, that's great, in Oakville, Ontario, where she lives with her family and 2 rescue dogs. Welcome, Natalie. Before we get into the work that you do you have an Austen or Pride and Prejudice discovery moment in your life?
Yeah, my Austen discovery moment is the Pride and Prejudice discovery moment. And I always think that Pride and Prejudice, I call it the gateway drug to Jane Austen, because it's just the most fun entrance point. But it was a book that my parents had on their bookshelves in the library and our living room. And it was in a box. And it had this like crazy little bookmark that stuck out the bottom. And they were like, don't touch that book. And so I remember I was like 9 or 10, and I was just really intrigued by this book as a concept. And it had an illustration too. But I remember when I opened it up, and there's a silhouette. And there's this lovely picture of Longborn by Isabel Bishop, done as like an ink and wash drawing. And I remember just thinking right away that it kind of looked like other books and didn't look like other books. And then I remember just reading the first few pages, and even though I was quite young, it was really understandable to me and very alive. And I remember right away reading this couple who are bantering / bickering, or they're in their regular familial way of chatting to each other, right? And like right away, Mrs. Bennet is going on, and Mr. Bennet's kind of ignoring her a little bit, like paying attention, like my dad would with the newspaper, as much as I love my parents. And I remember as I read it thinking, gosh, these are like my parents, and these kind of remind me of everyone's parents. And that whole first couple of chapters is the family and the playing favorites and the dynamics. I was the oldest of three. So I just really found that really relatable. And then it sucked me in. So then I read everything. And then when I was 12, right, embarking on adolescence, the Masterpiece Theater, English production with David Rintoul and Elizabeth Garvey came out. And I was just like, what is this? And then yeah, that's my story.
I watched all those too, as you know, as a teen, and I think I actually have a VHS recording of that as well. That I was just taping everything right off TV as they ran on Masterpiece Theater.
And people didn't, I mean, we're older, but in those days, if you didn't catch it on TV, like that was it. You could go like 10 years. I mean, I went 10 years, I think, before I got to see it again. So. Well,
it was just, it was for me, it was in the mid 80s. So, it was the dawning of the whole VHS video store thing. So, our circulating libraries as we were growing up. So I remember that production well, and I watched all of them that way. I can remember as getting older, at one point, I thought I knew Dickens really well because I had just watched all of the Masterpiece Theater, all the BBC adaptations. And I only read a couple of the novels. And then I had a quick like, oh, well, and then I went on a project and I read all the Dickens novels. But Austen, I liked that way, but then it took me longer to like her as an author. So.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, no, she was the one for me. After Anne of Green Gables and Harriet the Spy, it was Jane Austen. It was Jane Austen the rest of my life. She was the one that was always like, the minute I started to read her, she was music in my head. I felt like she lived in my brain. I didn't know how she got there. I just was like, wow, like I felt so connected to her. And I think readers do. And I think that is part of her magic, is you really do feel like she's in your head.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a great expression. She's the one for, that would be a good shirt. Jane Austen, she's the one for me.
Yeah.
So how does tell us a little bit about Jane Austen Society and what is this novel about, and how is it Jane?
Well, it's interesting because what had happened was I had spent a year coming off of a really devastating medical and ongoing kind of diagnosis for my husband, and the only thing I could read was Jane Austen. She was my comfort place. I it was that wonderful blend of comfort and suspense. Like every time you read her, you're kind of like, oh, how are these people going to get their act together? And I remember really getting to a point where I exhausted all 6 books and then reading sideways and just reading everything I could find about her. A lot of books up here by the guests that are going to be on this show, on this program, which is so cool to me. And I even took a trip for a week to Chawton when we were doing bucket list trips, and we were traveling. We went and renewed our wedding vows in Tuscany on a little hilltop chapel. But my husband also booked a trip to Augusta, Georgia to watch the Masters with his friends. And I was like, well, if we're doing stuff like that, I want to go to England on my own on the 200th anniversary of Jane Austen's death. And I want to pay homage to her for getting me through this difficult time. I am not making this up, Ed. Like I was like hardcore. This woman saved me. So I go to England and I go and it's the International Festival of Bath is on, and I go there first and watch the lectures and watch the parade. Then I go to Chawton, and it's kind of empty because of the festival. And I had time alone in Chawton House, which is the house that her brother had inherited from his adopted parents. And it's and it's really like close to the Jane Austen House Museum itself. And while I was there, I really did feel a sense of renewal and hope for this difficult situation we were within with a husband with a diagnosis of terminal lung disease. Then he was put on experimental drugs, and his lung decline started to stabilize. And 6 months later, I remember feeling hope again and feeling like writing. And then that's where you guys come in, because it was my 50th birthday, and I guess I was seeking connection, like through Jane Austen. I'd never gone to a Jane Austen Society meeting before. And the Jazz Night East End, I kept it.
That too.
I kept it. And as I was sitting there, the speakers at the
it was in Philadelphia, and
it was at the, I want to say the Merton Merton Golf and Country Club. Marion Cricket
Marion.
Club. Marion
Yeah,
Cricket
Mary
Club.
Craig Club.
And it was beautiful. And we're in this banquet hall, and I'm with my kid, and she was reading Frankenstein, the Ever the Rebel, at a Jane Austen Society meeting. And you noticed that and, and spoke to her.
You were at my table.
Yeah. And so, yeah, now she's doing her master's in creative writing. So, you know, and has studied Jane Austen. But I remember sitting there, and it was Persuasion, The Power of Persuasion. And there was a lot of talk about grief. And I had this light bulb moment where I just went, oh, crikey, I'm in a state of grief. I have lost the future. I'm not going to grow old as my husband. He was given 2 to 3 years of life, and he has successfully outlived his statistics so far, thank goodness. But right. I'm not going to grow old with my husband. I've lost the life that I thought I was going to have. And that's anticipatory grief. That was what a lot of people, I think, experienced during the pandemic. And honestly, I came back from this conference, and a few weeks later, I just looked at my family and I said, I want to write a book about a group of really different people who come together to try and save Jane Austen's cottage. And I knew obviously the real Jane Austen Society that had done this wonderful work, right? And how they had, you know, eventually through Thomas Edward Carpenter gotten the cottage was donated by him because he was grieving his son lost in battle. And there, it just seemed like setting it during the war. So my book takes place at the kind of the end of the war, World War II, when the people are just starting to come out of the trauma. Mm-hmm. They've suffered the losses, and they're going to have to learn how to keep living and how to engage. And the book is really about a doctor, a school teacher, a laborer, a servant, a wealthy woman, a lawyer, an actress, and an auctioneer. And they're all very different, but they all love or are falling in love with Jane Austen. And the book really just charts their connections and friendships and the decision to form a society and to try and save the museum where Jane Austen lived and worked on all of her works before it's too late. And it sort of parallels like the real life thing, but it's very made up, very all made up.
You didn't base them on the real people that.
No, I didn't want to feel.
Yeah.
No, I wanted to feel, I mean, I don't even think I thought about it, because for me, the joy of writing is I don't plot or know what's going to happen. So every day that I sit down to write, I don't know what I'm doing. And it's really fun. It's like it's like a drug. It's really exhilarating. And I didn't want to be kind of both the lawyer and me didn't want to tread on any toes or not respect people's arcs of their lives and their backgrounds. And I really wanted to be able to just let my characters go where they needed to go. Mm-hmm. So I knew that they were going to have to be fictional.
Great. And it was a hit. This book really appealed to people. And I think because of how well you've written it, but the idea of it as well, that because that's so much what these, you know, the Jasna groups around the world are like, and how, you know, people come together, but it's that bigger picture. That's that readers coming together in a surrounding a common book or a common author.
I mean, I think it's like the fandoms for the TV shows or anything in life that is a shorthand for realizing that when you meet a stranger that you have this immediate bond, and that it probably speaks to other qualities that you have in common. And one thing I'll say is that I think Jane Austen's readers are the nicest, best readers in the world. And I got to get a little bit of that moon dust because the readers of my book are the same. And it's there is something, I think, if you love Jane Austen, I think there is a core of an interest and curiosity about human nature, and not from a malicious or malevolent viewpoint of human nature as well. It's that sense of let's laugh at ourselves. Let's not take everything so seriously, but let's heed our inner voice. Let's be true to ourselves and fight the good fight so that we find happiness and sources of hope. Mm-hmm. And I think what Jane Austen is really writing about in the end is always hope.
Good. I love it. I agree. I loved, here's a little piece that'll maybe bring us into talking about, you know, Austen as a writer and how you kind of have worked at these things. But I love this piece towards the beginning with this one character, Adam. Is it Berwick, right? Yeah.
Barrick, if you're Richard Armitage. I called him Berwick the whole time I was writing the book. Then I hear the audiobook and he's like, Richard Barrick, Adam Barrick. And I'm like, oh no, I don't even know how to pronounce my old character's name.
There you go. He's a farmer in Chawton, and he's just reading Austen for the first time. And although at one time he was, you know, going to go to school, and was a reader when he was young, but now he had to take over the family farm and do that work. And he's just started to read Austen, and I love this piece here. It's he was becoming quite worried for Mr. Darcy. It seemed to Adam that once a man notices a woman's eyes to be fine and tries to eavesdrop on her conversations and finds himself overly affected by her bad opinion of him, then such a man is on the path to something uncharted, whether he admits it to himself or not. And it goes on about that. I mean, what I love about it, I don't read as well as Richard Armitage, but the what I love about it is that he picks up Austen and he automatically just starts thinking of them as people and how they would operate in the real world and in his world too. And that way that we, if you could talk about that way that we do it, that characters are real for us, not just something in a book in another world, but we attach ourselves to them as if we're meeting real people.
Yeah, I mean, I read books for the voice, but I care about the voice because I care about the character behind the voice. And I think that I write character-driven fiction that happens to be set in the past, and Jane Austen very much loved her characters. And I think what you get when you read Jane Austen is I think you get someone who loved her characters as much as any writer has ever loved their characters. And I think that comes through. And it comes through in the way she talks about them. She talks about them as if they're real. Remember that great
in her letters, yeah.
In her letters, right? About going, I think you were just quoting from that, right? In one of your earlier programs. And she's at some place where there's paintings and she's looking for, Mrs. B and, so it's a sense of Mrs. D, I should say. She's looking for Elizabeth.
She has a detail in a letter she writes to somebody in the family that about Mrs. Norris in Mansfield Park, and she actually says, "Oh, she gave him £1 as a tip or whatever, wherever it was." But that's not mentioned in the novel. No. So she, in her mind, had envisioned that.
And I think that embracing the power of characters in literature and letting them form the plot direction is like a skill that Jane Austen was the master of. We don't really know how she wrote her books. There's a lot of extraneous material that we're missing, and we know much more with modern writers how they're doing it. But there's lots of different plotting versus pantsing and things like that. Mm-hmm. And one of the things you get when you write by the seat of your pants is that you don't know where it's heading. So you're at the mercy of your characters, and your characters are usually keeping secrets from you. And as you write, you find them out. I think Stephen King once said, if you're not surprised when you're writing, how will your readers be? Yeah. And that's all going back to character. That's going back to character. And the narrative voice is a character as well, right? So the narrative voice is another character. It's not Jane Austen telling the story. It's not Stephen King telling the story, right? There's like this other voice, and so it's a love of the way different brains work. And I'll sort of pull the horse before the cart here, or the cart before the horse. But we had talked about before the program started about free and direct style or free and direct discourse, which is how I write. And what Jane Austen is doing that allows us to care about her characters and immediately bond with them and feel like we know them and therefore care about them and be invested in them is that she uses a narrative style that's very fly on the wall. She's got a narrator looking down. The narrator's in control. The narrator's telling you as much or as little as they're choosing to. They're not necessarily lying to you, but they're just giving you what they want to give you at that time. Mm-hmm. And then she goes into different characters' heads and will very seamlessly, suddenly you'll realize that you're actually looking at Darcy through Elizabeth's point of view now, not through the narrator. And there's actually a great moment in Pride and Prejudice, which when I was rereading it for the program at the beginning, when they first meet Wickham and Darcy and Elizabeth are trying actively, like he's trying not to look at Elizabeth. And she's like, what is going on between him and Wickham? Like they're both like upset looking. This is like long paragraph that's in the narrative voice. And then suddenly you go into Darcy's head and then you go into Elizabeth in the same sentence. I get in trouble for doing anything like that. I'm not allowed to do that. I actually am told by everybody in my industry that my switch between heads, my head hopping that I love to do, has to take place either between chapters or sections within a chapter with a time lapse. But in the Jane Austen Society, you'll see that I just went for broke, and I did kind of go into like different heads in the same scene, because that's how humor sometimes arose. And Jane Austen is doing that at this incredibly brilliant level. And that's one of her gifts to us, because it allows us to feel close to all of these characters. And also, I think a lot of her humor comes from the fact that these characters are very open about what they want. That's the other part of free and direct discourse, is they're either transparent because they're foolish. So they're Mrs. Bennet going, I need husbands for my girls. Or they're Mr. Collins going, I need one of your daughters for a wife. Like, they're very open. But then there's other characters that are incredibly closed. And how Jane Austen, goes into Darcy's head at certain moments going, oh, Darcy knew if he didn't, get a grip, he was going to be starting to be in danger. And the irony being that is like, he's gone. He doesn't even know it. And we get to know it, but we also get to know that he doesn't know it, which makes the proposal scene, also entertaining on a whole other level. So that is some of the ways in which Jane Austen is using this narrative style to create this magic for the reader.
What I love about it is that it kind of, it tricks you into thinking that this is exactly what, like it tricks you into thinking that it's an objective assessment of what's happening here in this scene, but it's actually not. It is a character's viewpoint. It is a perspective, and then the reader winds up taking the same perspective as characters, and then identifying when maybe they shouldn't identify. And I love the way that Austen is in command of, and you can see it developed in enough. I mean, she kind of perfects it in Emma. But it's working through her novels as she's doing it. So it's a very interesting question from Mimi, who wants to know, did your training in law school make you a better writer? She writes, lawyers have to persuade, argue, defend, characterize, etc. Did that lead you into writing better?
Very much. Mimi is actually the name of one of my characters, so I got a little brain freeze for a second there. There's a lot of famous lawyer fans of Jane Austen as well. So I think Jane Austen's way of setting up things and her own powers of persuasion and advocacy in certain situations, and also choice. What law is really doing is putting you in a situation where you are going to try and get across a complex situation. Because if it wasn't complex, we wouldn't be here. We're here because no one's dealt with this situation before, right? So we've had a breakdown, something's gone wrong, and now people are upset with each other, or they've made a huge mistake and the government and the police are upset with them. And for whatever reason, we need, as lawyers, to, in whatever field we practice, communicate really tricky concepts as efficiently, because the audience is just regular people who aren't trained like the lawyers, legal education is, as efficiently and as quickly as possible. And that is actually a lot of what Jane Austen does. And I think that it teaches you the power of the solitary word too. I mean, there are entire Supreme Court cases that have rested on the fact that a piece of legislation had a semicolon instead of a comma. Like, this can throw off the meaning of legislative intent. So when you come out of that kind of training, when you do sit down to write fiction, I do think that I bring to every word, I try, it's nowhere, it's not even on the scale of anything worth talking about, but I try with every word to make a choice. What's brilliant about Jane Austen is that the reason why readers can reread her is that she has made so many conscious and creatively unconscious choices, because her brain is just so superlative that there's so much there to be mined, and we can just keep going back to her and reading her and picking up new things. And you have to think about how she wrote these books, Edward, and I always think they're gestational periods. For a lot of those books, it's sort of close to a year. And I write my books in about a year. And there's something about living with a book over the seasons. And she would always start her books sort of in the summer or the fall, and she would finish almost a year later. And I could see her letting it marinate a bit, or she had to go somewhere and take care of a bunch of nieces and nephews for a few weeks or whatever, and then kind of coming back to it. And there's something about the way she's approaching the act of writing that says to me that she knew exactly what she was doing, but she was so in love with her characters that she was also kind of letting them drive the bus. So I'm torn, and I don't know, Edward, do you have a view at all on how much of this she just sort of let it rip every day, or if she had a big plan?
Well, the first two novels, Sense and Pride, are novels that were written over many years. Like we know that there were early drafts and then that didn't sell, and then she kind of reworked it. We don't know the extent that she redrafted those novels, but that definitely occurred. And then once she publishes them, then Mansfield Park's in a year, and Emma's the next year. And then she's on that cycle. And I think it's why there are things that I find stylistically in Mansfield Park as kind of developmental when she should be done that because she's already done a couple, but now she's kind of relearning how to like do this process within a certain time period. And then she writes maybe the most perfect novel in the English language in Emma. And it's, I mean, it can be people's favorite or not, but it is perfect. It's crazy perfect in style and how it's assembled and everything she can accomplish with characters and doing that. So I see a movement through the novels like that in how she develops as a writer. So, you're enjoying, I sent you the recipe today for the Netherfield. Are you enjoying one of those too?
Yes. My husband made this for me beforehand. It's really good. I recommend everyone use the recipe because it's really tasty.
I will be sharing that in a moment. So thank you. Cheers. What do you have coming up on the horizon? What are you working on now?
I have a third book that is connected to characters will show up from the first two books, but it's a standalone. It mainly focuses on a character from Bloomsbury Girls, which is my second book that just came out in May. And my first two books for the audience have a connection to Chawton because a lot of the resolution of the plot of the second book rests on an undervalued item that has been in the Chawton Great House Library, family library. And so in the third book, some knights show up again, and it's really fun. It's in with my editor right now, and it's due for release, I think probably in about a year and a half. So I'm going to be editing that for the next little while, and then.
And your books are staying within a universe. You have a.
I think that's another reason why I really relate to Jane Austen is because I feel like her characters continue to live for her, like you said, and I think that it's. When you have a lot of characters, I mean, she says it's 4 or 5 families, but when you add it up, it's a lot and it's wonderful. And there's so many great, amazing characters in her books. And I think she remembered them for a long time.
Well, best of luck with the new book. Thank you for coming on today. Thank you for taking a turn about the room with us today. And it's been, I'm so glad I met you at Jasna a few years ago, as I always am when I meet people who also like Jane Austen. So,
Thank you so much. Thank you. And good luck with the rest of the program. I'm loving it. Loving watching the installment. So thank you.
Thanks, Natalie. Cheers.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Well, everyone, coming up on next week's A Turnabout the Room in Austen Mondays, we'll be joined by Professor Emerita Jocelyn Harris to talk about what Jane read. Future guests on this segment include Claudia L. Johnson, Deborah Yaffe, Juliet Wells, Paula Byrne, and John Mullen. And I'm still signing up people to join those first moments with us. So let me take this moment right now to thank all of you for watching this episode. As a nonprofit organization, the Rosenbach Museum and Library depends on the generosity of friends and supporters like you to keep programs like this free and accessible to hundreds of fellow Austen lovers worldwide. Last week, we set a goal of $100 to help support the show, and you all so generously donated over $400 during the show, and there were 7 new memberships. I mean, it just knocked me out, so thank you so much for that. Tonight, we've set the goal to raise another $100, and hopefully that'll work, and if everybody would donate $10 by the end of tonight, that's a suggested donation. Obviously, any amount, no donation is too small to leave an impact on the Rosenbach community. And you can also become a member. At the end of today's show, I'll give a shout out to all those who donated or joined as members in the last week, including the last show. And if you donate or join tonight or just before the next show, I'll thank you by name in the next episode. Very quickly, 2 great in-person programs coming up this week at the Rosenbach on Tuesday, October 4th. Our good friend and co-host from Sundays with Dracula, Josh Hitchens, will be at the Rosenbach for a lunchtime talk to talk about his new book, Haunted Philadelphia. That is live in person at the Rosenbach at 12:30 in the afternoon tomorrow, October 4th. And on Wednesday, October 5th, we have an in-person Austen-related program for Rosenbach members only at the Rosenbach in Philadelphia. It's called Dress Smart and Behave Civil, Regency Costume in Jane Austen's England. Head on over to the Rosenbach website for more information and how to register for those programs. And I have to talk about this. Coming up on October 14th and 15th, we are having a marathon reading of Bram Stoker's Dracula. It's called the Dracuthon. And this is an in-person event in Philadelphia, just a couple blocks from the Rosenbach at the Trinity Center for Urban Life. We are still looking for a few readers. So if you live in the Philadelphia area and want to read some Dracula, contact me. But if you just want to come and listen, you can register at the Rosenbach's website for Dracuthon. We will also be live streaming the reading. Details about how to watch the live stream coming soon on our site. And yes, everyone, Austen Mondays merchandise has arrived. I'm wearing the Austen Mondays t-shirt right now. Let me share a picture of it with you. There we go. We have t-shirts, we have stickers, we have buttons. Members for the Rosenbach save 20% on all merchandise. You can go to the Rosenbach's website right now. There's a link in the chat here to go and buy some of the merchandise. It is always, as always with our merchandise, it is limited. So if you want a t-shirt especially, you better grab one right now while it's still there. And what else am I telling you about today? You can also join us on Facebook group page, Austen Mondays, for lots more info, news, links, conversation, and fun. But for today's chapter annotation segment, I want to welcome my co-host for today, Dr. Kathleen Hudson.
Hello. So
Hey,
nice
Kathleen.
to be here. Hello.
Good. I love having you here. Thank you so much.
It's so great you mentioned the merchandise. I was just talking to Lauren about how we must get ours very soon. So
yes. So t-shirts, it's the Darcy, the rendering of Darcy and Elizabeth on the back. It's the Austen Mondays logo there. And then we have the stickers and the buttons, and I hope you all enjoy it and have fun with that. So, but I'm also drinking today, and what I wanted to do is tell people the recipe for this drink in a segment I call Drinking with Jane and Ed. And today's cocktail I am calling the Netherfield, which is basically, it's just a champagne julep, if anybody's had one of those. It is a mint julep with more champagne in it than actual bourbon. So, you know, you muddle your mint up with some sugar, some simple syrup. Simple syrup, it's easy to make as well. Just it's equal parts sugar and water. Heat it up, stir it till the sugar dissolves, and then you got simple syrup. And I made some up, and then I crushed the mint right in it. So then it's mint simple syrup that I have. Put a little bit of that in your glass, put the bourbon in, top it off with the champagne, and don't forget a dash of bitters, because that's the Caroline Bingley part. Champagne Julep is for Netherfield, called the Netherfield, because I think Bingley is definitely leading a champagne life, and the whiskey is Darcy. He's kind of more substance. He's not bubbly at all like Bingley, his friend. Jane is clearly the simple syrup in this drink. She's all sugar. Elizabeth is the mint, because that's perfect for her. I think that kind of I think that herb is perfect for her. And Caroline Bingley is the dash of bitters. So cheers. Yes. It's really good too.
I think that's a very fitting. You need the champagne to get the Caroline Bingley down there.
Yeah.
You need all the help you can get for her.
I need to fill mine up a little more before we start. If you can skip the whiskey, if you're not a whiskey drinker, and then you're just drinking it's just a champagne cocktail, but you've got all the ingredients, and maybe you don't want any Darcy in your drink. I understand that could happen. All righty.
Heresy.
Enjoy. Some people don't. So, all righty. Enjoy,
All right.
everyone.
Cheers.
Cheers. So for today's episode, let me share this again. Today's episode, chapters 7 to 9, Sweet Jane and Muddy Elizabeth visit Netherfield.
We finally get into the building. That's great.
We do. My chapter co-host for this week is Dr. Kathleen Hudson. Some of you know her as a recurring co-host on Sundays with Jane Eyre. Kathleen also taught the Rosenbach's virtual Sense and Sensibility course earlier this year. Kathleen earned her postgraduate degree from University of Sheffield. She is the author of Servants and the Gothic, 1764 to 1831, A Half-Told Tale, and editor of the collection Women's Authorship and the Early Gothic, Legacies and Innovations. She's published widely on Gothic literature, class narratives, and women's writing in the 18th and 19th century. She currently works as an adjunct professor at the United States Naval Academy and Anne Arundel Community College. Thanks for coming back. Is all your bio still the same?
Yep. That's all. That's it. Yeah. So thank you very much for having me back. I'm very excited to be part of this and this book in particular. And just, yeah, it's great. So I'm
as I asked Lauren on the last episode, on your first episode, do you have an Austen or Pride and Prejudice kind of discovery moment in your life?
I think the thing with Austen is, and you said it so well in an earlier episode, is that I keep rediscovering her. Mm-hmm. That I do very much have a memory, like a sense memory of reading Austen as a teenager and falling in love with Sense and Sensibility and falling in love with Pride and Prejudice. And then sort of reading other things, like very much being obsessed with Austen, and then reading other things around it and sort of broadening the scope a bit, but then coming back to it. And then reading things like Persuasion, which is my favorite, later in life, and being like, oh yeah, that's the stuff. And later recognizing things like Emma, which I didn't like the first time I read it, but then I reread it later, and it was that
perfect.
But I think that too is kind of the nature of Pride and Prejudice. I mean, I'm still working from my very old, now very battered Pride and Prejudice. That was my first copy of it.
That's mine, just in the earlier edition.
Yes, the Oxford World Classics one.
That I have to keep using it just because I got it. Notes.
Knew when I got it. But it was hilarious because I also had a great sense memory thing where I cracked open the book and I'm like, oh, it smells the same. It's great. I had that book smell moment. But no, I think probably more. I mean, I do have memories of just being so very romantic teenager, like, oh, aren't these, like, very uncritical about any of the men in this, and then coming back to it later and being very critical of the men. But also just, I mean, I love too what Natalie was saying, that it is sort of the ultimate comfort book, not because it's easy necessarily, but because it's complicated, rather than because it's easy, because there is that element of suspense as well as familiarity, that no matter how many times I come back to it, I'm still a little bit like, oh, are they going to get together? Are you sure? Like, it is just, again, I think very much a testament to Austen's writing, that no matter how many times you read it, and no matter what stage of life you're at when you read it, there is always something that grabs you about it. So. Yeah.
Good. And even, as you make your trade as an academic now and teaching, writing, scholarly work, the fact that, it can still have that it's still that reader response, that emotional reader response, not necessarily the intellectual, let me take apart this text, that you can, that this book is so good, you can still have that, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's always a bit the caveat of working with anything that you love, is that eventually maybe there's always a fear, I guess, that you'll love it less because it turns into work instead of. And
you know how the sausage is made, kind of thing.
Yes. But I mean, I'm lucky. I think if you're going to learn how the sausage is made, doing that with literature actually, I think, only enhances the experience instead of takes away from it, because, now just because I know it's called free and direct discourse, now I admire it more in a way, because I'm like, well, yeah, but Austen invented it. And isn't that cool that we get to, that's almost seamless transition from omniscient narrator into somebody's mindset. And I'm lucky that I work in an area where I'm like, not only do I get to read all my favorite books all the time, but the more I learn about them, the more textured they become.
Good.
So that is I'm very lucky in that respect.
Now I'm inspired. I know we call these biblio ventures. Maybe we should call them literary sausage. So
yes, literary sausage. That's
what we do.
I mean, various appeal, maybe. Okay, well, the sausage, yes.
All right. Let me remind everybody that we have no spoilers in our chapter annotation segment. We only talk about what has happened thus far in the novel for two reasons. Number one, for people who are just encountering this for the first time, and I don't want to get in depth and kind of really make connections later that I want them to discover on their own as they're reading. But also, it's like I'm trying to go through it as the first time reader is reading it. This is all they know so far. Yep. So I like talking about how Austen reveals things to her audience, not serially, obviously, but still as it goes along. So
yeah.
So that's what we're gonna do. We hit chapter 7 here. We're beginning with tonight, and in chapter 7, it begins with property. Mr. Bennett's property consisted almost entirely in an estate of $2,000 a year, meaning that's what he brings in every year. That's what the estate gives him, which unfortunately for his daughters was entailed in default of heirs male on a distant relation.
Male.
Yes. And their mother's fortune, though ample for her situation in life, could but ill supply the deficiency of his. Her father had been an attorney in Meryton and had left her £4,000. So first of all, their family fortune isn't vast, and we've heard already about Bingley's, fortune and Darcy's $10,000 a year. So now we hear that Mr. Bennet brings in $2,000 a year.
Yeah.
And that's great for them to live well on, and the 5 daughters, and he and Mrs. Bennet, but
there's no future in it necessarily
because of the entailment, right? That if people don't know, an entailment, sometimes properties would do this, and that instead of it would go to the next male heir because they were dumb, because they thought that. Go ahead.
It's just funny because again, I taught Sense and Sensibility earlier this semester, and I was having massive Sense and Sensibility flashbacks. Because I mean that the whole first chapter is basically a very dry, almost legalistic detailing of here's where the money goes, here's where the property goes, and it very effectively linguistically as well as just in practical terms, describes a system which itself erases women from the inheritance line, because that's just how it works. It goes to the next male. And that is sort of then the thing that hinges everything that happens after. It's this ghost haunting the text of, yeah, but you don't get any money when anyone dies. I mean, I do feel like that is very much underappreciated as the axe hanging over everyone's head, is that this is a very cheerful romance, but they are just one male family member away from becoming the Dashwood sisters and having to go live in a very, very small place in the middle of nowhere, sort of on sufferance. But yes, that it not only erases women, but then it gives it to undeserving men. And
that's the key. That's why I call it dumb, because it's like, if it's really about preserving this kind of family line, then
anyone but who it goes to.
Well, it's always a real roll of the dice, because clearly as a family patriarch, you would want it to go to your own children, not someone outside of your immediate, sphere, and that's what it winds up doing. So
well, and I appreciate too that prior to this in earlier chapters, when they are talking about Bingley and Darcy, they are also hinting at that as well. That Bingley has inherited this stuff, but we've forgotten that we originally got all this money from trade.
Yeah.
And that Darcy is very much the blue blood who hasn't inherited quite a bit. So he has a real sense of inheritance too. So that it doesn't emerge as quite the problem it is for the Bennett family, but it is definitely there, this concept of inheritance, maybe deserving, maybe not, but this idea of, that's something you need to pass down.
Well, at some point in time, Darcy ancestors just had a bunch of money and got land, because he's not aristocracy.
No,
They have a land, but they've had it for a long time.
Yes. The idea that this is still something that is part of the family. Yeah.
And so Bingley is just that in the making. It's just newer. Like
yes. Him at a different stage. Yeah. The butterfly stage, the moth. He's still the cocoon.
But the Bennets are no different. Mr. Bennet has an income as a gentleman, and that's all he has. He doesn't work. He has inherited this. We don't know how long it's gone back, but he's married Mrs. Bennet, and then we get that little bit about her, that her father was an attorney in Meryton. Not even it's a solicitor that goes and tries.
Just an attorney. £4,000, which is not bad, but it's not great.
They handle cases and do things outside of the courts, and but that's a family in trade. A lawyer is a tradesman,
and they say respectable trade, but still trade. So and
then we get more, like her sister marries a guy who was a clerk. Clark to her father, and it's just the language there in that second little paragraph. Clark, business, respectable line of trade. I mean, we're very, Austen's really laying on the terms there to let us know that that's the class that Mrs. Bennet comes from,
and that everyone's very firmly now entrenched in.
And of course, then soon enough, the Bingley girls will be hypercritical of that connection.
Although again, Austen does, I think, very much make the point of, they feel like they have the right to be hypercritical only because they've really erased their own family history effectively, and have focused on we're gentlemanly family and erased the part but our money comes from here. So just sort of brush stroke over that.
Well, the village of and I want to point this out to everybody. It says the village of Longborn was only 1 mile from Meryton, and sometimes people get confused. Longborn is the house that the Bennets live in, so why are they calling that a village? And so I thought Meryton was the village. It is. Longborn is considered a village. It is the estate house, and other people live on that land who may have some kind of trades, blacksmiths or whatever, that are connected to the house. But they could also do trade with the town. The town would be Meryton, where that's the kind of commercial district there. So, but Longborn is not just a house. It is a landed estate that has the main house where the Bennets live, and also other people live on that land, and you could kind of call that a village, or at least it does in the novel. And right now, Catherine and Lydia, or Kitty and Lydia,
the key part of this is it's close to the shops, so not too far away from the milliners.
And we get a little bit about Kitty and Lydia, and this is emphasized over and over in these opening chapters, by the narrator, by the way people talk about them, especially Mr. Bennet and the way he talks about them, but how their minds were more vacant than their sisters. And the only thing that excites them is the only kind of news that excites them, and they learn it from their aunt, of course, is
the officers.
Is the arrival of the militia.
Yes, the most important. Well, and again, I love this is sort of continuing previous conversations from episodes, but it's gossip again. And it is, to be fair, the arrival of a group that will continue to impact everyone's lives is the militia. Not only because it's a reflection of the fact that we are a country at war at this point, but there's so many eligible men in uniform. Just lovely. I do love that line too. A large fortune was worthless in their eyes when opposed to the regimentals of an ensign.
Yes.
So we've got priorities. We're focused on the correct things, which is nice looking uniform, as opposed to
in a nice looking uniform. Because a nice looking uniform automatically makes anybody better.
Yes, my mother can worry about the fortune. I'm worried about the aesthetics of this.
Austen knew this too. There's a letter from September 15th, 1796. She's writing to Cassandra, talking about friends and people they know. And at one point in the letter, she says, if you should ever see Lucy, you may tell her that I scolded Miss Fletcher for her negligence in writing, as she desired me to do, but without being able to bring her to any proper sense of shame. I mean, she's so funny. She writes that Miss Fletcher says in her defense that as everybody whom Lucy knew when she was in Canterbury has now left it, she has nothing at all to write to her about. By everybody, I suppose Miss Fletcher means that a new set of officers have arrived there. But this is a note of my own, she writes at the end. So don't tell anybody, this is a note of my own. Yes. But that Austen herself experienced this, and she knows that when the
everyone knows who counts as people of interest in this, and it's definitely the officers here.
When the officers come to town, all the younger women pay attention to them. So and Mr. Bennet continues here. He calls them the silliest girls.
Yes.
Jill has a quick question here. Did we ask this last week? How do the neighbors know other characters' property worth and income?
Everyone knows that.
Yeah, like somehow. It's not like how do they know? It is that they all know. It is that is information that is just
it's part of your identity. I mean, it's you are so and so. This is how much you have a year. It's almost
and you gain it through gossip. You gain it through this news information system.
But also, no one is keeping it a secret. I almost do think that there's just an ongoing property evaluation. You just automatically kind of know how to do the math of there's this much land, there's this much this is how much the house is. I mean, when they do that kind of, and here's everything that's in the house. I feel like that's almost an unspoken language that everyone could just sort of evaluate a place very quickly.
In my life growing up in America, it became a thing that you weren't supposed to talk about. And that maybe that's because we were middle class and you weren't supposed to talk about that kind of thing. But I can remember as a kid, telling people my dad makes this much money. And my mom found out. It was so angry. You're not allowed to tell people that. And I was like, what are you talking about? I thought he did make this much money. No. That's not what.
That's not the point. The point is you don't say that.
It's become something secretive here, but I think especially in this very stratified society, it's important because it defines who you are.
Yeah. Although I will argue too that we do still signal that at a certain point, you ask what someone does for a living. And I think we all can admit to sometimes making an assumption then about how much they make. Someone says they're a neurosurgeon versus a kindergarten teacher, then I guess you can maybe make that assumption. So, I mean, I do feel like we signal it in different ways, but this whole, this is so-and-so, this is how much their net worth is. I don't think we say that anymore.
Well, it's funny, you say an attorney now and people think, ooh, I guess you do pretty well for yourself. Yeah. You say attorney in Pride and Prejudice and they're they're a snob about
just working stiff here.
But the Mr. Bennet is again, we get this emphasis how silly they are.
Yes.
We get this great interchange between he and Mrs. Bennet, which is very funny. And this part of the charm of this novel and how it works so well is them bantering back and forth. And I think as it goes on and by the end, we can really make some strong value judgments on how negative of how bad of a relationship is. But that's more in our own terms. So I don't want to pull it out of and pull it into modern day terms. But
I mean, I do kind of, I hope on some level, I picture it on some level as Mr. Bennet, if not enjoying his wife's company, at least finding this banter somewhat amusing, or at the very least familiar enough to feel like he gets he snaps back very much. We get quite a few husbands who don't even bother to respond to silly wives. And I know I may be in the company of other Mrs. Bennet apologists here, but I also don't think Mrs. Bennet is as foolish all the time as she sometimes gets credit for. I mean, she makes a couple points.
We'll get there. That'll develop as it goes along. Now, I think she's sheer foolish.
Yeah, that's fair. Although again, that's sort of accidental.
She gets things though. She understands what's going on.
That accidental, my dear Mr. Bennet, you must not expect such girls to have the sense of their father and mother. I'm like, you're not wrong, but also you have no sense. So, and they're quite closely related to you. And that's
what I just said. It was too big. Like she understands what's going on only as much as it kind of fits her conception of the world. Yeah. And she's actually almost just lucky that she does harp on the one thing that is really vitally important.
Yeah.
And
better lucky.
Luckily it's not like her dogs. Like she doesn't have a pug dog like
no.
in Mansfield Park. And
I was going to say, although there is a precedent for silly wives with dogs. So
but she also is for us too someone who identifies with her daughters and lets us know that, and we know that she's the same kind of person that Kitty and Lydia were. She says, I remember the time when I liked the red coat myself very well. And indeed, so I do still at my heart. Like it's still in her. And so we can very much understand that Kitty and Lydia, well, that's Mrs. Bennet when she was young.
Yes.
When she met Mr. Bennet. So, which
you do have to wonder how that initial meeting was. You really do.
And there's probably a novel of that.
There's got to be.
I want to know what that
some
is.
imagination of
that is. Let me know if there is a novel about Mr. Bennet meeting Mrs. Bennet, because I want to read it. Yes. They mentioned the officers did not go so often to Miss Watson's as they did when they first came. She sees them now very often standing in Clark's library. I love this little mention that the circulating, like Meryton has a circulating library. Libraries are meeting places. They're fashionable, and they would, just like any place is fashionable, it will go in and out of fashion. But they're also this kind of step in England at the time of this kind of mass literacy. They're established as businesses. They're all about making money. And I kind of think like the best way to describe what a circulating library is that they're like video stores used to be, where you would go to rent videos because, and maybe young people watching and say like, what do you mean? What's a video store? Because that doesn't exist anymore.
A Blockbuster? What's that?
I worked at a video store.
All gone now.
VHS tapes, man. So but even that model, like most people didn't want to own the actual video. They just wanted to watch it. So that's what the model was all for. And it's the same model for the circulating libraries. Like to buy a book costs a lot of money, but you could just pay a subscription or break that up over the course of seasons, and it's a lot cheaper, and then you get the books to read. And
I will say they're also too early fan culture to a certain extent. I mean, if you wanted your book to work in a circulating library, first off, you broke it up into sections so that people would borrow the updated sections.
They're really renting them is what they're doing.
Yes, but if you want people to rent your books, then you do it in installments, and you leave it on a cliffhanger. This volume ends here, and now you have to pick up the newest Gothic novels installment here. So I think it's quite interesting in that it is kind of a cross between that and updated cable television.
Well, and then what serial fiction would become in the 19th century, which is very much what a lot of television is now. Austen knew this too. She belonged to circulating libraries and writes about them in her letters. And
and was developing into a very savvy, I think, authorial businesswoman that she had. I mean, when she first started out, she made a couple bad business choices, such as selling a copy of a book to somebody who wasn't going to publish it. But she learned how to make money off of her work, which was an ongoing process for her. So,
and this is her learning how to write too.
Yeah,
because she's a reader, and not all great readers are great writers, but all great writers are great readers.
Yes,
and
absolutely.
So she's reading and places like she has her family books at home, but this enables her to really expand the kinds of books that she reads and the number of books that she reads. And I love the little mention of it here that it's also a fashionable place where you go to also check out the officers. And why are the officers going there? Because they know the young ladies are going there.
Yes, that's a guaranteed place. Men in fiction. That's all we want.
Well, we get a letter here now from Miss Bingley, inviting Jane to come visit them.
I love the reason too. Why?
Because it is, my brother and the gentleman are to dine with the officers, so we want to have you. Is that yeah?
Well, but also a whole day's
yeah
tete-a-tete between two women can never end without a quarrel. I'm like, if you don't come immediately, I will murder my sister. So you must come.
Yes,
because we need a third party. I think that's especially, again, telling because Caroline Bingley then kind of sets up this whole women versus women, and these are the allegiances, and I'm going to gossip with my sister about you when you're not in the room, and then I'm going to criticize you for bringing down the entire sex, basically.
Yeah.
So she sets herself up very early as this combative woman who does not necessarily like other women.
Mm-hmm.
Which again is interesting this is a family, the Bennett family is a family full of women and one poor lonely man, and sisters who I'm sure don't always get along, but seem to function, and have their own kind of groupings. And we had been talking, in previous episodes about gossip and the importance of communication, but between women, and how that's sort of weaponized as a women-specific thing. So for her to basically be like, I cannot stand being in the house alone with this other woman. All the men are gone. We have no like third party here to moderate. Please come at once before we start an actual fight. So yeah. It's also
a letter, and we get so many letters in this novel. We know Austen loved novels from the 18th century that were written in epistolary form, that they were all letters. I find that her style, this free and direct discourse that we talked about earlier today, and I've talked about in another episode, that I think that kind of arises out of that. It's like, how do I get the intimacy of a letter and then write it as a third person narrator? Well, that's what she does. That's what she winds up doing, and that's the style. And it's led many scholars to believe that the first draft of Pride and Prejudice may have been an epistolary novel. That she then later changed and pulled out what she needed to from the letters, especially the dialogue. And some of them still survive. So but we have one here, and it's from Caroline Bingley, and it leads to Mrs. Bennet's plot.
Her scheme.
Yes.
Yeah.
What does she say there? No, my dear. Wait, do you have that there? Can I have
yes, no, my dear, you had better go on horseback because it seems likely to rain, and then you must stay all night. And then Elizabeth says, that would be a good scheme if you were sure that they would not offer to send her home. But she's thought of this because she knows exactly where the chaise is. She knows what horses are available. So it's
automatically, like, it's not like she had long to plot this up. The letter just came, they found out, and she just clicks right through her head that like, go on horse, and then you'll get caught in the rain, and then you'll have to stay, and or it'll rain after you're there.
I don't think either way, they couldn't possibly let you go here in the rain. And
her hopes were answered. Jane had not been gone long before it rained hard. Her sisters went easy for her, but her mother was delighted.
Yes. A lucky idea of mine, indeed.
Yes. So she gets to send her daughter there in the rain, and takes full credit for it. And then we get another letter, and this one's from Jane. My dearest Lizzie, and that she has a sore throat and headache. And yeah, the plot worked, but guess what? I got sick. And people make light of this. Mr. Bennet makes light of it. If your daughter should have a dangerous fit of illness, if she should die, it would be comfort to know that it was all in pursuit of Mr. Bingley and under your orders. And he can make light of it, but let's also realize if you get a fever,
yes, that's a bad.
You can die.
Well, again, I had a flashback to Sense and Sensibility where Marianne gets her socks wet and nearly dies from it.
Mm-hmm.
And that entire episode, and again, Claudia Johnson has an amazing article about this and the politics of female sensibility and the erotics of being ill, basically, of the heroine of sensibility when she's committed this folly must then fall ill and die, because that's what heroines do, is they fall ill in these very gorgeous, dramatic ways that remove them. So when Mr. Bennet says, that it was a comfort to know it was all in the pursuit of Mr. Bingley, I think it's another one of those moments where Jane Austen is very pointedly pointing to the politics of sensibility and how that, frames female suffering, and in some cases kills women, because they get sick and then they die.
And Jane is ill. So
and Jane is ill, yes.
Whether or not she'll die, I won't reveal yet. But but Mrs. Bennet is still happy about it.
Yeah, and again, I think that fits into Mrs. Bennet's romantic maneuvering of this, which is, well, if she's sick, she's still pretty and sick, so we can maneuver this. This actually places her very well as a heroine of sensibility. How can Bingley resist that?
Yeah. And Bingley will have to save her. And then that will attach him even further.
Yes.
Well, Elizabeth's having none of this. I'm going to go visit her, and they're like, you can't, it's muddy out, all this dirt. And she goes anyway. I shall be very fit to see Jane, which is all I want. And I always want to notice what Mary says. I'm paying a lot of attention to Mary in this novel.
Or Mary, yes.
And Mary says, I admire the activity of your benevolence, observed Mary, but every impulse of feeling should be guided by reason. And in my opinion, exertion should always be in proportion to what is required. Which doesn't really mean anything. It's just like,
that's a lot of words to say nothing.
Yeah, like you can go if you think you should go, or not if you think it's worth. It all depends.
Is it in proportion to what is required? Who knows?
Yes. So.
And I do love that the next sentence then is Kitty and Lydia saying, we'll go as far as Meryton because we want to go shopping.
Yeah.
So it's like, yes, also heavy words that mean nothing, also actions that tend to mean nothing as well.
And meet the officers. Well, it means a great deal to them. And
yes.
And this is a way too of reading the book where I forget being young reading the book, in that the most important part of my young life was, yes, I want to go meet people, potential partners, and do that.
Of course.
That's
I'm sure Jane is fine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So Kitty and Lydia are about to do, or just want to do what they should be doing. And Elizabeth's going to go though and take care of Jane.
And this is what makes me fall in love with Elizabeth as a character, frankly. I think it's not that I didn't enjoy the first chapters of the book, but I felt like I didn't get as much insight into Elizabeth as a person. But her doing this, I think, really solidified her for me as someone I really
why is that? What is it about you mean the act of going, or the act of getting dirty and going, or how does it all?
Both. I think the act of going, because I think it really does speak to loyalty, and love and affection. I mean, she has her Mary who says, yeah, you should go if you feel like it, but not, I mean, who knows? And Kitty and Lydia who just go off again to see the officers. But yeah, that she's with weary ankles, dirty stockings, and a face glowing with warm exercise, walks 3 miles and then walks into this breakfast room and sort of like, what's up? Where's my sister?
Yeah.
Just goes basically straight, like does not care necessarily to talk to anyone in this breakfast room.
Yeah.
Doesn't stop to think about what the impression she's giving. She just wants to see Jane, and she stays with Jane most of the time. And I think it was just one of those, like, that speaks to such loyalty too. And even I mean, Darcy what he sees is he's torn between admiration of the brilliancy which the exercise had given her complexion and her fine eyes, I'm sure, and doubt as to the occasions justifying her coming so far alone. That she is independent, but also, and I didn't realize this when I was reading it as a teenager, but I do recognize it now, that it's, again, a country at war. There is an element of danger to her traveling alone, but she does it anyway. And she really doesn't make any bones about it. She's just sort of like, of course I'd go. It's Jane. I gotta make sure she's all right. And I'm not going to trust that she's all right until I see her. And when I see her, I'm going to stay with her. And I don't, so that was just one of those things where it was one of those, it's a small thing maybe, but it's not wildly throwing off convention, but it does suggest, I think, not caring if the important thing is, I got to go find my sister.
I think it's very important. I think that loyalty sense, but it's also just the overall, disregarding convention. She defies convention, and she's done this. She does it now with the mud and getting dirty, but she's done it already when Darcy kind of admonishes her at the dance, the very first dance, and she kind of defies that by making a joke of it. She defies convention by when Darcy gets to dance with her, she says no. Yeah. To her friend Charlotte, she defies convention in the way she talks about the importance of securing a partner, a marriage partner, and how important, and that's so important for her. But she's like, no. I have to be this independent person that lives my life this way. And she always has a good reason for what she thinks. Well,
that's what I think too, is that it's not just defiance for the sake of defiance. Like she's not just well, I don't like how the whole structure is. She's just like, I have my priorities and I have my values, and I'm going to laugh when I want to laugh, and I'm not going to, pander to Mr. Darcy when I don't like him. And I'm not going to care if my hem is covered in mud when the thing I'm really focused on is making sure my sister is okay. Yeah. It's that it almost doesn't even occur to her that she's defiant in this way. It's that she's just like, whatever, I got to do what I got to do. And these are my values. And I just think that does speak to a very deep, like admirable quality.
Well, of course, the Bingley sisters, it's Mrs. Hurst and Miss Bingley, Caroline, are horrified, and her weary ankles and dirty stockings and a face glowing with the warmth of exercise. While they condemn her, Darcy says very little, and actually thinks that they're what does he say, or what's the narrator say, that she looks kind of the Darcy was divided between the admiration of the brilliancy which exercise had given to her complexion and doubt as to the occasions justifying her coming so far alone. So again, it's she shouldn't have done this. Like, man, you look good, babe.
Yeah. And two, also that his position is she shouldn't have done this, not because she's filthy, but because it was dangerous. And there is, I think, that element of concern of, are you sure that that the risk justified the reward of you coming here? Which I think is worlds different from the Bingley sisters' opinion, which is just she looks like a mess and she's not presenting well. But Darcy, I think, I mean, again, is almost chivalrous in that kind of, I'm more concerned for her safety.
He's still torn.
Well, but definitely still torn. Like definitely not 100% on this at all. Yeah.
Well, let's jump to chapter 8, in which Jane's was by no means better, that she really is worse than she wrote that she was. And
this is another thing. Elizabeth's very perceptive about her sister's character, in that she knows Jane was not lying exactly, but definitely understating the illness in the letter. Yeah.
And then we get to see the other characters without Elizabeth, and which is kind of you think that it's a novel. I mean, it's setting up Elizabeth and Darcy to come on the scene, and then they are. But what we get in this novel are scenes that Elizabeth doesn't know anything about, and we get to see that as well. And we get the kind of characters in the room and Caroline Bingley especially condemning her to Darcy. I shall never forget her appearance this morning. She really looked almost wild. And, why must she be scampering about the country because her sister had a cold? And she looked so blousy.
So untidy.
And Darcy just, and she's, and she tries to bring Darcy's sister into it. Like, you wouldn't see your sister make such an exhibition. He says, certainly not. But they're talking about it, and Darcy gives a kind of, he puts her in her place again. He says, not at all. They were brightened by about her eyes. Caroline's just stupid. Like, don't talk about her eyes. Stop teasing Darcy on this, because I
find this very interesting, though, because again, bringing it back to that female gossip thing, is we have women gossiping about, again, and in a very combative way, about other women who are not in the room. But the goal of it too is to kind of manage the men. Like, they're very pointedly having this conversation and drawing the men in an attempt to manage them somehow, which is, I just find very interesting, because again, they're using that very female specific conversation thing of gossip, and the men are kind of like scrambling to keep up. Like, Bingley is trying to kind of defend both Bennet sisters, and he can't quite keep up with the cattiness. And then they try to bring Darcy in to sort of be like, oh yeah, I mean, I think we can all assume that Caroline Bingley is after Mr. Darcy. Like she's there's an end game here, and she kind of thinks he's in the bag because his friend, they spent a lot of time together.
Yes. she's got it made.
So it's just very interesting, again, that she is trying very much to manage him, basically, and to moderate his feelings by really the only way she can, which is by making these social judgments verbally. She can't force him into any other kind of thing, but she can loudly make these pronouncements and assume that he reads that as a broader social critique, and then he'll reevaluate his liking of Elizabeth. It doesn't really work for her, but I do think that
she works hard at it, though.
Yeah, that's an interesting weaponization of speech, and female speech specifically, to try to make that happen.
And we consistently see how it backfires on her. Here again, it backfires on her, because then he says, well, actually, she looked pretty good. And even though she was dirty, and of course, my sister wouldn't do that, but she looked pretty good.
And another cool thing about having this as a conversation is, again, you're left to interpret what is not said, which is, we can guess at Caroline's motives, we can guess at Bingley's motives, and we're trying to guess at Darcy's motives here, which is we get a vibe from him that's not, I mean, again, this is sort of the flip side of free and direct discourses. We're not getting insight into the character's head. We're only getting what they're saying, and most specifically what they're not saying, which is that Darcy is not engaging the way Caroline Bingley wants him to in this conversation. But he does say, actually, no, she looked quite nice.
That's good. And that's something I'm going to keep noticing as we go forward, because we do get this free and direct discourse and what we're kind of being led to believe. But also at times, Austen is specifically hiding what characters think. Yeah. Especially with Darcy.
As a very, and again, an interesting social critique, but for Darcy too, we can't read them, and neither can Elizabeth.
Well, Elizabeth returns, and then she doesn't want to play cards with them because she's suspecting them to be playing high, which means like, because they're gambling, because they're rich, they don't care. They're like, oh, sure, I bet you this many pounds, I don't care. She's like, I can
take or leave board games anyway, but when it's with people I don't like, I especially can leave.
And I'm not going to lose money playing a game with you guys, and I don't even, so
I'll read.
But then we get another funny. All of Mr. Hurst's lines are really funny. But she was going to amuse herself with a book, and Mr. Hurst looked at her with astonishment. Do you prefer reading to cards? That is rather singular. And it leads to this whole Elizabeth has to now defend herself. I'm not a great reader. I
Yeah.
have pleasure in men.
Well,
She
and
doesn't want anybody
two,
to define her, right?
yeah. Caroline's attempt is she despises cards. She is a great reader and has no pleasure in anything else. That she just pushes her immediately into this box and is like, I've said it, therefore you are here. Again, I think very much speaks to her MO, which is if I verbalize it enough, then it'll happen and I'll just wing it into existence here. But yeah, that she's not a great reader.
Yeah, because look, it's not because I'm some, great reader.
Yeah.
I just would rather read a book right now. Like, she's not going to be defined by anyone, but then we get this great, their libraries. And I'm like, yeah, I want your library.
Yes.
Library of Pemberley, and this library is not so great. And
I think it's interesting though. It's because yes, it's that Pemberley has a great library, and he says it has been the work of many generations. So we get again this conception of Darcy as someone who is inheriting, but also maintaining that there's people who inherit, men who inherit, I should say men who inherit and are undeserving of it. And again, Bingley, for all of his everything, admits that he doesn't have a large collection and that he, I am an idle fellow. And he is also not a big reader. But Darcy, I found this such an interesting line that I had not really noticed before, but Darcy says, I cannot comprehend the neglect of a family library in such days as these. Yeah.
I noticed that too.
Yeah. I mean, I was reading it and I'm like, does he mean because of the war, or is he thinking that it's like a morally complicated time? You need a family library. I think it's a commercial
modern day thing. It's like, there's no point not having a lot of books when you can have so many books now. Books are readily available to people. We had a mention of the Circulating Library before. Like, a rich person can, of course, acquire books now. In the past, it was very difficult. I mean, there were far fewer books published, and as they're going along now, the publishing industry is booming.
Yes.
So of course you could, but with Darcy, it's always it's all about character too.
Yes. Yeah.
You need to have the character. If you have the right character, you will buy a lot of books, and you will buy the right books.
Yes. And you'll buy it for the family library, which again, I think is a bit of a throwaway line, but I think it does hint to actually something positive in Darcy, which is that it's not just for him. He's very conscious of what he's inherited, but also what he leaves behind.
Yes.
And he is actually very family oriented, although it does not seem so. But I mean, we kind of get that from his loyalty to Bingley too, is that he is kind of ride or die in that respect, is he is more family oriented than he maybe is letting on in his personality.
And I don't think Darcy's going to be, putting any Gothic novels in his library. So
secret Gothic novels, small Radcliffe corner in the corner.
Yeah, there you go.
Maybe not.
It'll be disguised. On the top shelf.
Yes.
But then we get into this conversation about the kind of like the perfect woman, like a lady's accomplishments and what she should have. And it begins.
I do love this section.
This whole teasing thing, and it's Caroline Bingley who kind of sets it all out. Well, I think it is. Some people, because it says, "Oh, certainly," cried his faithful assistant. And some people think it could be Bingley, but I think it's Caroline that says this. A woman must have a thorough knowledge of music, singing, drawing, dancing, and the modern languages, possesses something in her air and manner of walking, the tone of her voice, her address and expressions. Yeah. Darcy adds to it. What does Darcy add to it?
He adds, all this she must possess, added Darcy, and to all this she must yet add something more substantial in the improvement of her mind by extensive reading. Yes, I think we would have to give this to Caroline, because Charles Bingley's idea of an accomplishment is that she's very good at macrame, basically.
Yeah.
That she can make cushions, and
she's nice, she's pleasant, good looking and pleasant, I think is what Bingley's looking for.
Yes, they paint tables and cover screens and net purses. And that's his view of accomplishment. It is an interesting, again, I find very class specific. It's interesting that what Bingley is describing is really producing work, like, it's almost like work, of, maybe you're doing it in a genteel setting, but I kind of think of the various poorer female characters in Austen novels who make their living basically by making purses or embroidery, and that's how they sustain themselves. And that's kind of what Bingley is saying. Oh yeah, that's an accomplishment if you can, make things. Whereas, yes, of course, his faithful assistant Caroline, yes, that she just rattles through what we assume she has as accomplishments, because she is very much self-promoting, and it's such a big list, and then it ends on such a vague, a certain something in her air and manner of walking, that it's no wonder Elizabeth is like, yeah, I'm surprised at you knowing only 6 accomplished women. I rather wonder now at you're knowing any, because it's this weird, impossible, vague thing. Yeah.
She calls them out on it, that this is a fantasy, and I'm going to call you out on it.
And especially call out Mr. Darcy, because he's so lax any kind of social grace. I mean, he has the money and the position, but what are his accomplishments socially? Not much. I do think there's that undercurrent throughout this of, isn't it kind of hypocritical to make all these assumptions about what makes the perfect woman, and at no point really talk about what makes the perfect man here on the flip side of that.
And that's part of the kind of imbalance that happens in this novel, and that we do get this, and that people doing adaptations have to kind of fix, but it is very much a novel centered about women and how they should behave or how they should not behave, and we get that with Darcy too, but you never get this in-depth, kind of description of what the men are supposed to do. Maybe, well, we haven't so far, so that's all I'm going to say. And maybe we'll get some more of that later. But again, Caroline tries to, knock her down when she leaves. And Darcy's having none of it, because Darcy.
Well, and again, it's very ironic, because her thing is, she's one of those young ladies who seek to recommend themselves to the other sex by undervaluing their own, which is exactly what Caroline has been doing consistently, is she brings down other women to make herself look better. All
righty. Well, there's two. Then Elizabeth leaves, goes back to her. I like how it's just that she kind of, before she leaves, Elizabeth soon afterwards left the room, and she just like ditches them. She's like, all right, you guys can keep talking.
I'm bored with this. I'm going. I'm out.
But the last chapter we get to here for today, Mrs. Bennet arrives with Kitty and Lydia too. Poor Mary got stuck at home, and
I think Mary probably prefers it that way at this point. But
yeah, maybe. Well, she doesn't. I think Mary would rather not be with her mother and Kitty and Lydia, certainly.
Yes.
And the couple things I would hit in this chapter, but one, well, Mrs. Bennet kind of continues her plot to keep Jane at Netherfield, which she succeeds in doing. Bingley kind of forces it, and it forces Caroline to go along with it, his sister. But then Mrs. Bennet starts to, she starts to go at Darcy, who she doesn't like, which is so odd, because you'd think she would be deferential to the guy who is the richest guy, and she's not. She still believes that sociability is, as long as you're rich and you can take care of the woman, is what is most desired, and Darcy doesn't have that.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because, I mean, the premise of this also sort of starts with, again, Elizabeth as reader. Because she kind of reads to a certain extent Bingley of, that's exactly what I should have supposed at you, because they're talking about Netherfield. And he says, oh, you begin to comprehend me. And it is this kind of idea. I mean, Bingley calls Elizabeth a studier of character. So they set Elizabeth up as this person who is actually a very good reader, but she reads people, not books. And then immediately following that, Mrs. Bennet misreads something Darcy says as an insult. I think she's not deferential to Darcy. I think at least partially out of a similar kind of prejudice or pride, because he snubbed Elizabeth. But also I think she reads his critique of the country as an insult to her personally, like that he's saying she's not, she doesn't have, this isn't a good society to be in, where that's not what he was saying. And Elizabeth actually is kind of forced to defend him, which is quite awkward. So yeah, that this is a chapter about, again, how Miss Bennet misreads and Elizabeth reads.
Uh-huh. We had a quick question here from Kristen. She wanted to know Caroline's age, and Caroline Bingley is anywhere from 24 to 26. And just to give a quick rundown on ages, Jane is 23 and Elizabeth is 20. Her sister Mary is 19. Kitty is 17 or 18. Lydia is 15 to 16. And then Bingley is 22 or 23. Caroline's slightly older than him, 24, 26. Darcy's 28. And so he's the older one of them. We've already heard that Charlotte was 27. Darcy is not only the most kind of, or the highest of the order of everybody, but he's also the oldest. And there's enough of an age difference between him at 28 and Charles Bingley at 22 or 23 for Darcy to be the leader also in age. And I know more about life and things that have gone on, and let me guide you. Caroline is anywhere from 24 to 26, which puts her in the kind of, she could be heading towards 27 and up spinsterhood.
Not that.
She's got to get Darcy because, maybe she's getting older, but
yeah.
I don't know if we have an exact number on her.
And again, I know none of us are Caroline fans, but there is, I mean, I always feel a sense of kind of pity, if nothing else, that there's a clock ticking here, and there is an air of slight desperation in everything that she does, which is it's a lot.
Well, Mrs. I want to see if we find out if we by the end if we get any Caroline fans, because people read different novels differently.
Yeah.
I like Mary Crawford a lot in that part, and she's certainly not supposed to be liked.
Yes, context is everything.
Readers, yeah. Mrs. Bennet completely. She's trying to make herself seem important and her family important, and she does nothing but just assure Darcy and the Bingleys that they are not of their class, even though she thinks she's saying the very opposite. But then we get this exchange toward the end I want to hit before we finish today of that about love and I do think this is one of the best singers
ever.
Mrs. Bennet is trying to talk about people were in love with Jane, and Elizabeth, to change the subject, starts with this thing about writing poetry, and she says, I wonder who first discovered the efficacy of poetry in driving away love. And Darcy says, I have often been used to consider poetry as the food of love. And then where does Jane reply, or Elizabeth reply?
Of a fine, stout, healthy love it may. Everything nourishes what is strong already. But if it be only a slight, thin sort of inclination, I am convinced that one good sonnet will starve it entirely away. I do love that. This is great.
And Darcy only smiled, and then there's a general pause, and
again, he doesn't respond, but I love to read this as he's genuinely tickled by her response, because
it's a smart one, right? He takes the bait. Yeah. And wants to like kind of debate her on this, and then her response is, it's not artful, but it's reflective, and it's clever too. It's also clever, but it's reflective, not artful. It's not, I'm not saying something to get you to like me, as Caroline constantly does.
Yes.
She's like, and it's very interesting. And I think, he's, again, this is another thing for him to
fall over.
Yeah.
It's good. This is going to simmer now. It's
Yeah.
just going to light simmer. No, I think that response is, again, hilarious. And it invokes all these, again, heroine of sensibility, dramatic poetry reading things. And then it's like, oh no, that's the worst poem you've ever read.
Because then we get, well, Lydia then tells Bingley, you have to have a ball, and that'll happen. And so that's an important plot point. But then the very last paragraph is that they leave and Elizabeth goes off with your sister. And then while the Bingley sisters are
leaving the poor men to fend for themselves with the Bingley sisters.
Yeah, Darcy could not be prevailed on to join in their censure of her, in spite of all Miss Bingley's witticisms on fine eyes. And
yes.
And I think it was that last comment of hers that was like, he must
now the fine eyes are the least of it. Now he's really meeting Elizabeth as she is as a person, which
there's something behind those fine eyes.
Yes, she ran across the 3 miles in her muddy socks to give me a zinger about poetry. It's great.
Yeah.
What's not to love?
He's buying it. So well, Janeites, thank you all for tuning in today. Thanks to our show sponsor, Lisa Washington. Thanks to all of you who have donated tonight. And if you did, I'll give you a shout out next week. But right now, I'd like to thank those who donated in the last week. And that is Betty B. from Barnegat Township, New Jersey, Christine L., Michelle H., Margaret F., and Beverly H., all from Philadelphia. Lauren C. from Lawrence Township, New Jersey, Christine L. from Hellam, PA, Sharon P. from Bealton, Virginia, Maureen P. from Haddonfield, New Jersey, Paul S. from Wyomissing, PA, Gretchen S. from Bristol, PA, Kate P. from Doylestown, PA, and Karen D. from San Antonio, Texas. Thank you all for donating to this endeavor. And another way to get involved is through membership. Membership starts at $55 and gives you free museum admission, discounts on programs and courses, and exclusive invitations to member-only events like the one we're having this week with the Regency Fashion. You can learn more about how to become a member on our website. And there were members from our audience this week, 7 people. Allison M. from Philadelphia and Janet L. from Philadelphia joined. Jane H. from Wayne, PA, George G. from Middletown Township, New Jersey. Oh, Betty B. from Barnegat Township, New Jersey joined and donated. Thank you, Betty. Karen P. gave a membership as a gift for Elizabeth P. From Portland, Maine. So thank you, Karen, and welcome, Elizabeth. And Eileen A. from Provincetown, Massachusetts, and Ann O. from Woodside, New York. As you can tell, as I'm saying all this, it's all over the place. So thank you all, and I'm glad to bring this audience together from all over to engage in this literary sausage making experiment that we're doing.
Names still to be decided, I think.
Thank you all for playing a part in the future of the Rosenbach, for allowing me to continue to creating one-of-a-kind programs and courses. Remember, we have an Austen Mondays Facebook group where you continue the conversation. Look us up on Facebook, join in that conversation. But remember also on the Rosenbach's YouTube account, like the Austen Mondays videos, subscribe to the channel, leave comments there as well. I'll be answering questions from the show there as well as the week goes on. Thanks to Brianna, who was our chat, Mrs. Reynolds, for managing the links in the chat. Next week on episode 4, we'll talk to Jocelyn Harris from New Zealand about what Jane read. And then we'll explore chapters 10 to 12, A Turnabout the Room at Netherfield. The actual name of the episode is called A Turnabout the Room. It'll be following a segment called A Turnabout the Room. Don't get confused. And Casey McMillan, our new rotating co-host, Casey McMillan will be joining us next week. You should come too. Thanks to Natalie Jenner, who joined us earlier for tonight's A Turnabout the Room. Kathleen, thank you. I am so glad you're back.
Thank you for having me. This was a blast.
I love doing this with you, and you'll be back in like 3 weeks now, right? Yeah, yes. So
we'll wait.
See you again soon. Thanks to Tucker Christine, who wrote our opening credits and closing music. Thanks to my daughter Lulu, who shot and created the credits with me. Farewell, readers. May you all be singular enough to walk through the mud and prefer reading to cards. Bye-bye, everyone.